Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Invisible Surgeon.
I had never been one for superstitions or ghost stories. My world was grounded in facts, procedures, and the often harsh reality of hospital life. But that all changed one fateful night at St. Martin's Hospital. It was an ordinary night shift, or so I thought. The emergency room was buzzing with activity, but that was nothing unusual. We were handling a series of routine cases when the code blue came in, a young man in critical condition after a car accident. The injuries were severe, and we had no choice but to rush him into surgery. The operating room was prepped quickly, the team and I working in tense, practiced silence. The patient's life was in our hands, and we couldn't afford any mistakes. We began the procedure with grim determination, but it wasn't long before things started to go terribly wrong. As I made the first incision, something inexplicable happened. The instruments, scalpels, forceps, and clamps began to move on their own. They floated through the air as if guided by an invisible hand, drifting away from our control. My heart raced, and I exchanged bewildered glances with my colleagues. We tried to grab the tools, but they slipped from our grasp, as if resisting our attempts to restore order. Panic set in quickly. The once familiar operating room had become a chaotic battlefield, with instruments moving and clattering as though they had a mind of their own. My thoughts raced as I struggled to keep the situation under control, but it was like fighting against an unseen force. I could feel a cold, almost malevolent presence filling the room, intensifying the sense of dread. Despite the chaos, we managed to stabilize the patient, though it felt like a miracle. The surgery was far from perfect, and the emotional and psychological toll on all of us was immense. We had faced something that defied all logic and explanation, and it left us shaken. After the operation, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The other staff members seemed to sense it too. Whispers started circulating about strange occurrences in the operating room. Some claimed they felt an inexplicable chill, others heard faint, disembodied voices. It was as if the room itself was haunted by something far beyond our understanding. As I tried to push through the rest of my shift, the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had interfered with our work, something that had no place in the world of science and medicine. The experience was etched into my memory, and I knew I would never be able to look at that operating room, or the patient we had saved, in the same way again. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel the very fabric of reality as we knew it. In the days following the surgery, I found it impossible to escape the shadow of that night. The operating room, once a place of life-saving precision, now felt like a haunted relic of our failure. I tried to push the unsettling experience to the back of my mind, but the whispers and strange occurrences made it impossible to forget. The atmosphere at the hospital grew increasingly tense. The staff spoke in hushed tones about the incidents, but no one seemed willing to openly discuss what had happened. I overheard conversations in the break room about cold spots and strange noises coming from the operating room. It wasn't just idle gossip. Something was clearly wrong. One evening, while preparing for a shift, I noticed that the operating room was colder than usual. The chill was so pronounced it seemed to seep through my scrubs and reach into my bones. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the hospital's aging HVAC system, but the feeling of unease persisted. During one procedure, I caught a glimpse of the instruments, one of the same tools that had moved on its own during the chaotic surgery. It was lying on a tray, but I noticed it shifting slightly, as if being nudged by an invisible force. I tried to rationalize it, but my heart pounded as the memory of the previous night's events resurfaced. The patient we had saved had begun to deteriorate. He had been recovering well initially, but his condition worsened inexplicably. He spoke of nightmares, of a dark figure hovering over him during the surgery, a sensation of being watched and violated. His descriptions were so vivid and chilling that they sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't dismiss his claims any longer. Something supernatural was clearly at play. I decided to investigate further. After my shifts, I would sneak into the operating room to observe, hoping to find some logical explanation for the bizarre phenomena. Each time I entered, the room felt unnervingly cold, and the faintest sound seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets. One night, while I was alone in the operating room, I heard a soft, disembodied voice. It was barely audible, but it clearly said, "Help me." I spun around, but there was no one there, just the sterile empty space of the operating room. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of cold air wash over me, as if something had brushed past. The eerie sensations were not confined to the operating room. I began to notice the same unsettling chill and whispers in other areas of the hospital. It was as if the entire building was being affected by whatever was haunting the operating room. My once rational mind was now plagued with doubts and fears. Desperate for answers, I decided to look into the hospital's history. If there was something or someone causing these disturbances, I needed to understand the background of the place where these horrifying events were unfolding. I started sifting through old records, hoping to find clues that would explain the malevolent presence that seemed to be lurking in the shadows. As I dug deeper, I came across the name Dr. Theodore Graves, a figure whose reputation had been clouded with mystery and controversy. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that Dr. Graves was somehow connected to the disturbing events unfolding at St. Martin's. The weight of the unknown hung heavily over me, and I realized I had to delve deeper into the hospital's dark past. The ghostly whispers and chilling encounters were more than just a figment of my imagination. They were pieces of a puzzle that needed to be solved if I wanted to put an end to the terror plaguing the hospital. I'd hoped that by investigating the strange occurrences, I'd find a logical explanation, but the deeper I dug, the more unsettling things became. Dr. Theodore Graves, a name that had surfaced repeatedly in the hospital's old records, seemed to be at the heart of the mystery. What little I found about him only deepened the enigma. Dr. Graves was a legendary figure in the field of surgery, renowned for his groundbreaking techniques and impressive success rates. But there was a darker side to his legacy. As I pored over the dusty, yellowed files and old newspaper clippings, I discovered that his methods had often been described as unorthodox, even unethical. According to the records, Dr. Graves had worked at St. Martin's when it was still a small clinic. He had a reputation for pushing the boundaries of medical science, performing procedures that were considered experimental at best and barbaric at worst. There were whispers of patients who had suffered under his care, their stories hushed up to protect his career. It became clear that Dr. Graves' obsession with perfecting his craft led him down a dark path. Some documents hinted at experiments that went beyond medical ethics, surgeries conducted long after patients had died, or procedures performed in secret. The stories were disturbing, suggesting a man driven by a need to conquer death itself, no matter the cost. One particularly chilling account described how Graves would operate in an isolated wing of the hospital, a section that had been sealed off for years. The descriptions of that wing were vague, but it was clear that it had been a place of secrecy and shadowy practices. As I delved into the details, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Graves' spirit, or something that bore his name, was still connected to the hospital. The eerie events in the operating room and the patient's horrifying descriptions seemed to align with the sinister legend of the surgeon. The more I uncovered, the more convinced I became that Dr. Graves was not just a figure of the past. His presence, or whatever had replaced him, was still very much active. It was as if his spirit had never left the hospital, continuing his work in a grotesque parody of his former self. One evening, while browsing through an old archive room in the basement of the hospital, I came across a locked cabinet. My curiosity got the better of me, and with some effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside, I found more of Dr. Graves' personal belongings, his journals, photographs, and a strange assortment of surgical tools. One of the journals was particularly unsettling. It was filled with detailed notes about procedures, sketches of anatomical diagrams, and disturbing entries about pushing the boundaries of human endurance. The last few pages were scribbled in a frantic scrawl, describing a transformation and a desperate need to continue his work beyond the grave. It was clear that Graves had become consumed by his quest, and it seemed he had never let go, even in death. The discovery of these items only intensified my resolve to understand what was happening. The evidence pointed to a malevolent force that had taken root in the hospital, a force that was likely connected to the ghost of Dr. Graves. As I left the basement, I felt a cold draft pass through me, and I glanced back at the dimly lit corridor. The sensation was unmistakable. Someone or something was watching me, lingering just out of sight. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew I was getting closer to uncovering a truth that was both terrifying and dangerous. The time had come to confront the spirit of Dr. Graves, or whatever remained of him, and put an end to the horrors that had plagued St. Martin's Hospital. But as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was venturing into a realm where human understanding and sanity might not apply. The air in the hospital grew colder as I prepared for what I feared might be the final confrontation. The stories of Dr. Graves, the chilling accounts, and the strange occurrences had built up to this moment. I knew I had to face whatever malevolent force was at work, whatever remnants of Dr. Graves' spirit might be lurking in the shadows. One night, after everyone had left and the hospital was silent, I made my way to the abandoned wing. This was the area Graves had been rumored to have used for his secretive procedures. The corridor was dark and dusty, with a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. My footsteps echoed eerily as I walked, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I reached the door to what used to be Graves' operating room. It was locked and rusted, but I had managed to find an old key in the archives. With trembling hands, I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I had imagined it. Faded blueprints on the walls, old surgical tools scattered around, and a large, dusty operating table in the center. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the room seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows were thickening around me. I set up a flashlight and a small camera, hoping to capture any evidence of the supernatural. I began to speak aloud, addressing Dr. Graves directly. "I know you're here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've read about what you did, and I understand that you're trapped or tormented. But this isn't the way. You need to let go." The response was almost immediate. The lights flickered, and a gust of cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. In the darkness, I could hear the faint sound of a scalpel scraping against metal. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled to relight the flashlight. When the light finally flickered back to life, I saw it, the shadow of a figure standing at the edge of the operating table. It was translucent, with an almost imperceptible outline that suggested a man in a surgical gown. I could see nothing of his face, but the presence was unmistakably menacing. "Dr. Graves, I know you're trying to continue your work," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. "But you have to stop. This is not what you wanted." The figure seemed to waver, and I heard a low, mournful sound, like a deep, sorrowful sigh. The air around me grew heavier, and I felt a deep sense of despair, as if the room itself was mourning the loss of something precious. The shadow began to move closer, and I could feel an intense pressure building, like an invisible hand tightening around my chest. Desperate to break through the oppressive atmosphere, I reached into my bag and pulled out the journal I had found in the basement. "I found your journal," I said, holding it up. "I know about your experiments, and I understand your pain. But continuing this torment is not going to help you." As I spoke, the figure seemed to hesitate, the shadow flickering uncertainly. The room felt as though it was caught between worlds, a place of conflict and unresolved issues. I began to read aloud from the journal, focusing on the passages where Graves described his regrets and his desperation for redemption. Gradually, the pressure in the room lessened. The shadow of the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, and the temperature began to stabilize. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, as if the presence was finally beginning to find some peace. But just as I thought the confrontation was over, the lights flickered one last time, and I heard a final, anguished cry, an echo of the suffering that had taken place in that room. The cry seemed to fade away, leaving behind a haunting silence. I knew the encounter had changed me. I had faced a malevolent force and, in some small way, helped to bring about a resolution. But the experience left me with more questions than answers. The hospital's history was forever altered by the presence of Dr. Graves, and though the immediate danger had passed, I was left wondering if the shadows of the past would ever truly leave St. Martin's. As I left the abandoned wing, I took one last look at the operating room, now eerily calm. I had faced the specter of Dr. Graves, and though I had not vanquished it completely, I hoped I had provided some measure of peace. The hospital would continue, and I would too, but the memory of that night would remain with me, a constant reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. The aftermath of that night was a mix of relief and lingering dread. I hoped that by confronting the malevolent spirit of Dr. Graves, I had brought some semblance of peace to the hospital. But the experience left me deeply unsettled and questioning the nature of the forces I had encountered. In the weeks that followed, the hospital began to show signs of returning to normalcy. The cold spots and eerie noises in the abandoned wing ceased, and the staff seemed more at ease. Patients reported fewer unsettling experiences, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the hospital began to lift. It was as though the dark cloud that had been suffocating St. Martin's was slowly dissipating. Despite the changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The encounter with Dr. Graves had left me with a sense of unfinished business, as if there were still unanswered questions about the past. I continued to research the hospital's history, driven by a need to understand the full extent of what had transpired. One evening, while reviewing some old files in the hospital archives, I came across a forgotten box labeled Historical Records. Inside, I found a series of documents that detailed the construction of the hospital and its transition from an old asylum. The records were incomplete, but they offered a glimpse into the grim history of the place. It was clear that St. Martin's had been built on the grounds of an old asylum known for its cruel and inhumane treatments. The asylum had been shut down after numerous reports of abuse and experimentation. The documents hinted at a series of controversial surgeries and dubious experiments conducted by a Dr. Theodore Graves, who had been one of the asylum's most infamous figures. The more I read, the more I realized that the horrors of the asylum had not ended with its closure. The hospital's construction had been an attempt to bury the past, but the spirit of Dr. Graves, and the echoes of the suffering he had caused, had persisted. The confrontation I had faced was only a small part of a larger, unresolved story. I decided to share my findings with the hospital administration, hoping that they would acknowledge the dark history and perhaps address it in some way. To my surprise, the administration was receptive. They had suspected that something was amiss but had been unsure of how to address it. My account of the haunting and my discoveries about the hospital's past prompted them to initiate a more thorough investigation into the building's history. As for me, the experience had left its mark. I continued to work at St. Martin's, but I approached each day with a heightened awareness of the unseen forces that might be at play. The hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It was a reminder of the delicate boundary between the living and the dead. The finality of the confrontation with Dr. Graves was not a resolution in the traditional sense. It was a recognition of the enduring power of unresolved pasts and the need to confront them, no matter how terrifying or painful. The hospital had found some peace, but I knew that the specters of history, both literal and metaphorical, were never truly gone. As I walked through the hospital's corridors, I would occasionally feel a chill or catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. The experience had taught me that the world is filled with mysteries and shadows, and sometimes the only way to face them is to confront the darkness head-on. The memory of that night, and the ghostly figure of Dr. Graves, would stay with me, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown.
The Ghost Elevator.
I've always thought hospitals were unsettling, but you get used to it after a while. At least, that's what I told myself when I started my new job as a night shift nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center. It was a massive building, the kind of place that had endless hallways and too many rooms to count. I figured the eerie feeling would wear off with time, but there was one thing I couldn't shake: the rumors. It started with little comments from the other nurses. They'd talk about the elevator, not all of them, but enough to make me curious. They said it was off. Sometimes, it would stop at a floor that didn't exist, an unmarked level that wasn't on any map. But whenever someone got off to investigate, they'd disappear. I laughed it off at first, assuming it was just an old prank played on the newbies. Hospitals are always full of strange stories, and I figured this was just one of them. That was until my third night shift. I was already exhausted, making my rounds and delivering meds to patients on the 5th floor. Normally, I would take the stairs, but that night, my legs felt like lead. I decided to take the elevator, even though the rumors still lingered in the back of my mind. I pressed the button and waited. The doors opened with a quiet ding, and I stepped inside. The ride was smooth at first. I leaned against the wall, trying to keep my eyes open. I pressed the button for the 5th floor, expecting to arrive there in seconds. But instead, the elevator didn't stop. It kept moving. Then, without warning, it jolted to a halt. The display above flickered. No floor number. Just a blank, empty screen. The doors slid open, and I froze. The hallway in front of me wasn't one I recognized. The walls were gray, the kind of dull color that you see in abandoned buildings. There were no signs, no lights, just a dim glow from the flickering bulbs overhead. Everything was silent, too silent, and there was a faint smell of something old, like mildew and decay. For a moment, I considered stepping out, but something inside me screamed not to. My instincts were in overdrive, and the more I stared into the dark corridor, the heavier the air felt around me. It was as if something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a move. I hit the close door button, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors hesitated, almost as if they were stuck. But after a second that felt like an eternity, they slowly slid shut. The elevator groaned and finally started moving again, this time heading to the 5th floor like nothing had happened. When the doors opened, the familiar sights of the hospital greeted me. Bright lights, the soft hum of monitors, the usual quiet shuffle of nurses and patients. It was as if I'd just imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I went about the rest of my shift in a daze, my mind replaying the moment over and over. At the end of my rounds, I mentioned it to one of the senior nurses, Carol. She had been working at St. Catherine's for over 20 years. "Have you ever had the elevator stop on the wrong floor?" I asked her, trying to sound casual, like it wasn't still haunting me. Her face went pale. She looked around before answering in a low voice. "You saw it, didn't you? That floor." I nodded, suddenly feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Don't talk about it to anyone else," she whispered. "Just don't take that elevator again." She walked away before I could ask more, leaving me standing there, more unsettled than ever. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. That elevator wasn't just malfunctioning. There was something wrong with it, something unnatural. And I was determined to find out what. The elevator incident from last week replayed in my mind constantly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but whenever I tried to talk about it, people would change the subject or act like they hadn't heard. Carol's warning had left a mark. Don't take that elevator again. Simple enough advice, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Things took a darker turn during my next shift. A few days ago, Mr. Thompson, one of our regular patients, had been chatting with me about his family and his favorite old movies. He was an elderly man, a constant presence in the ward, his stories as comforting as his kind smile. But that night, he was gone. I didn't think much of it at first. Patients get discharged or moved all the time. But when I checked his room, I found it empty. His bed was neatly made, and his belongings were gone. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where he'd gone. His medical record showed no discharge and no transfer orders. That's when the rumors started to hit home. I overheard some nurses whispering about a patient who had vanished after using the elevator. My heart sank as I realized Mr. Thompson had been one of those patients who disappeared without a trace. The same elevator I had experienced that eerie stop. Determined to find out what was happening, I decided to dig a little deeper. My research took me to the hospital's records department. I accessed old patient files, cross-referencing disappearances and the elevator's service records. The more I looked, the more I found inconsistencies. Missing persons reports, unexplained absences, and a disturbing number of cases where patients had simply vanished after a visit to that specific elevator. One night, while I was going through the records, a nurse named Lisa approached me. She had a worried expression on her face. "You're looking into the elevator, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Be careful," she warned. "I've heard things. People who went into that elevator, they never come back. Or if they do, they're not the same." Before I could ask for more details, Lisa hurried away. Her warning left me more unsettled than before. I had no idea who to trust or where to turn, and the thought of being alone in this investigation was terrifying. That night, I resolved to be cautious but not deterred. I wanted to find answers, and if the elevator was the key, I had to uncover the truth. My shift ended, and I reluctantly went home, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Thompson's empty room, his smiling face, and then nothing, just the cold emptiness of that unmarked floor. The next day, I took every opportunity to question anyone who might know more. However, each time I approached someone, they either avoided the topic or seemed visibly uncomfortable. It was clear that the elevator and the disappearances were a sensitive subject, and I was getting closer to a truth that was meant to stay hidden. I knew I couldn't just let it go. If there was something wrong with that elevator, I had to find out what it was before more people disappeared. But as I prepared to confront the mystery head-on, I felt the weight of the unspoken warnings pressing down on me. The elevator had claimed its first victim that I knew of. What other secrets did it hold, and how many more lives would be caught in its grip before I uncovered the truth? After piecing together the unsettling patterns of disappearances, I felt an increasing urgency to understand what was happening at St. Catherine's. The elevator was more than just a faulty piece of machinery. It was tied to something far more sinister. I spent days combing through old hospital records and archives. Every time I made a breakthrough, it seemed like the information was deliberately obscure or incomplete. Finally, my persistence paid off when I discovered a series of documents in a dusty, forgotten corner of the hospital's administrative office. These files were old and yellowed, detailing the history of the land the hospital now occupied. What I found chilled me to the bone. St. Catherine's wasn't just built on any old site. It was constructed on the grounds of an old asylum, an asylum known for its horrifying practices. The asylum had been closed down decades ago, after a series of inhumane experiments on its patients. The documents detailed experiments involving psychological manipulation and physical abuse, with the goal of curing mental illness through extreme measures. The experiments had ended in tragedy, with many patients dying or disappearing. The most disturbing revelation was about Floor Zero, a secret basement level that was supposedly sealed off after the asylum's closure. The elevator was once the only way to access this floor, where the worst of the experiments took place. When the asylum was shut down, the floor was meant to be completely off limits, yet there was the elevator, still functioning, and still stopping at this forbidden level. One night, I found myself alone in the hospital, sifting through these documents under the dim light of my desk lamp. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. My nerves were on edge, and each rustle of paper seemed louder than the last. I had managed to locate a blueprint of the old asylum that showed the layout of the basement levels, including the notorious Floor Zero. As I scanned the blueprints, my phone buzzed. I looked down to see a message from an unknown number. "Stop looking." The message was chillingly brief, but its intent was clear. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. Determined not to be intimidated, I continued my research. I needed to verify the connection between the elevator and the sealed-off floor. The documents mentioned a key component of the experiments, a series of rooms designed for extreme isolation therapy, which were located on the very floor the elevator was now accessing. I decided to confront the situation head-on. Despite the growing fear, I planned to investigate the elevator again. I was determined to see what lay behind the door to Floor Zero. If the elevator was still operating, it meant that someone, was keeping the secrets of the asylum alive. That night, I approached the elevator with a mix of dread and resolve. The memories of Mr. Thompson and the other vanished patients fueled my determination. I had to know what was happening, no matter the cost. When the elevator arrived, it was as if it had been waiting for me. The doors opened slowly, revealing the same dark, foreboding hallway. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The doors closed behind me, and I descended into the darkness of the unknown. The elevator stopped at the familiar unmarked floor. The dim light from the corridor seeped into the elevator, casting eerie shadows. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The corridor stretched ahead, silent and oppressive. The air was colder here, and the smell of decay was stronger. I followed the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The walls were lined with old, rusted equipment and abandoned rooms. My flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to move on their own. As I ventured deeper, I found a heavy, metal door partially ajar. I pushed it open and was greeted by a sight that made my blood run cold. Inside was an old examination room, with instruments and restraints still in place, covered in dust and cobwebs. On a table lay a stack of old files, some of them covered in bloodstains. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The evidence of the experiments was all around me. I needed to document this, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold the camera steady. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I took one last look around before deciding to leave. The oppressive silence was broken by a sudden noise behind me, a faint whispering, almost like the rustling of paper. I spun around, but there was nothing there. With a final glance at the horrors of Floor Zero, I rushed back to the elevator, my heart racing. I could barely keep my composure as the elevator ascended, carrying me back to the safety of the hospital above. As I emerged, I knew that I had to expose what I had found. But I also knew that I was now a target. Whoever, or whatever, was hiding in the depths of St. Catherine's would not take kindly to my discovery. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous this investigation became. I was in too deep to back out now, and I had to uncover the full truth before it was too late. My heart raced as the elevator doors closed behind me, but the eerie silence of the hospital seemed even more oppressive. The discovery of Floor Zero had shaken me to my core, and the feeling of being watched lingered with every step I took back to the main floors. I returned to my shift, trying to maintain my composure, but the weight of what I had seen was unbearable. I couldn't shake the images of the examination room, the old equipment, and the blood-stained files. I felt a growing sense of urgency to share what I had found, but I was unsure of who to trust. The message on my phone and the warnings from Lisa and Carol made it clear that this was not a situation to be taken lightly. That night, strange things began to happen. Patients started reporting unsettling occurrences. One elderly woman claimed that her floor-stand moved on its own, and another patient said they saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their room. These were the kinds of stories that often got dismissed as hallucinations or stress-induced paranoia, but they seemed different this time. More real, more tangible. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I would hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, just as I turned a corner. The hospital's usual hum of activity seemed muffled, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made every creak and groan of the building sound sinister. It wasn't long before I experienced the first of what I could only describe as supernatural events. I was in the break room, grabbing a cup of coffee, when I felt a cold breeze brush past me. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly, making my breath visible in the air. Shaking off the chill, I headed back to the ward. As I walked down a dimly lit corridor, I noticed that one of the elevator doors was slightly ajar. The elevator was not on my floor, but the door was open just enough for me to peer inside. I approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The interior of the elevator was dark and still. My flashlight illuminated the space, revealing the usual sterile, metal surfaces. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd, a small, handwritten note taped to the wall. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, almost as if it had been written in a hurry. The note read, "They never leave. Don't trust the elevator." My hands trembled as I pulled the note off the wall. Just then, the elevator jerked and began its descent, even though I hadn't pressed any buttons. The sudden movement startled me, and I stumbled back. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and the elevator was on its way to the forbidden floor. Panic surged through me. I had to stop it, but it was too late. The elevator stopped at floor 0, and when the doors opened, I saw the hallway stretching out before me, exactly like it had before. I hesitated, but my curiosity and fear drove me to step out. The hallway was even more chilling this time. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift with each step I took. I heard the whispers again, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The sensation of being watched was overpowering, and the cold air felt like icy fingers brushing against my skin. As I walked further down the corridor, I noticed that the door to the old examination room was wide open. The room was empty, but the unsettling presence from before was palpable. The files on the table had been disturbed, as if someone, or something, had recently been there. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic. I could make out a few words now, fragmented and tortured. "Help us, trapped, escape." My pulse quickened. I realized I wasn't alone on this floor. The feeling of dread was suffocating, and I could almost see the faces of the patients who had suffered here. It was as if their spirits were trying to reach out, to warn me, to share their pain. I backed away slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The elevator was my only way out, and I needed to get back to the main floors before I was overwhelmed by whatever haunted this place. As I hurried back, the lights flickered more violently, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. I felt a cold hand graze my arm, and I spun around to find nothing but empty air. My heart pounded as I reached the elevator and slammed my hand on the call button. The doors finally closed, and I breathed a sigh of relief as the elevator began its ascent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but I knew that what I had experienced was just the beginning. The spirits of floor 0 were restless, and their anguish was far from over. Back on the main floors, I was greeted with the same eerie silence. The hospital had returned to its normal routine, but I knew better. The elevator, and whatever lay beneath, was far from being forgotten. I had to continue my investigation, but I also had to be careful. The ghosts of St. Catherine's were not just remnants of the past. They were very much a part of the present, and they were growing more desperate by the day. The events of the past few nights had left me feeling like a ghost myself, haunted and barely tethered to reality. I knew I had to get to the bottom of what was happening at St. Catherine's, but the more I uncovered, the more dangerous things seemed to become. The whispers from floor 0 had not stopped. Patients and staff alike were reporting disturbances, and the atmosphere in the hospital had become increasingly tense. Everyone seemed to be on edge, but no one was willing to openly discuss what was going on. It was clear that the secrets of the elevator were too deeply buried for anyone to talk about. One night, while on my shift, I received an anonymous tip. The message was simple: meet me at the old storage room after hours. I have answers. My curiosity outweighed my fear. I was convinced that this was my chance to uncover the truth and end the terror once and for all. As my shift ended, I made my way to the storage room, which was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the hospital, far from the usual paths of staff and patients. The corridor leading to the storage room was dimly lit and unnervingly silent. Each step echoed in the emptiness, amplifying my sense of dread. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar, as if someone had been waiting for me. I pushed it open cautiously. Inside, I found a man standing in the shadows. He was older, with a weary face that seemed familiar. As he stepped into the light, I recognized him as Dr. Harlan, a former psychiatrist who had worked at the hospital many years ago. His reputation had always been shrouded in rumors, and now I understood why. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I heard you've been investigating the elevator." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I need to know what's going on. What is this place really hiding?" Dr. Harlan sighed deeply, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You've uncovered part of the truth. The elevator is a gateway to the floor where the asylum's most inhumane experiments took place. The patients who vanished were not just lost, they were trapped between worlds." He explained that the experiments performed at the asylum involved attempts to break the barrier between life and death. They had used extreme psychological and physical methods, hoping to achieve a form of immortality or to communicate with the dead. The experiments failed catastrophically, leaving a rift between our world and the restless spirits of the patients. "The elevator," Dr. Harlan continued, "wasn't just a means of transport. It was a conduit, designed to access the floor where these experiments were conducted. When it was closed off, the spirits were left trapped, unable to move on. They are bound to that floor, and their suffering has only intensified." I could hardly process the information. Why didn't anyone stop this? Why was the hospital built here? Dr. Harlan looked pained. After the asylum was shut down, the hospital was built to replace it. The authorities covered up the asylum's past, hoping to erase the horrors. But the spirits remained, and the elevator became a link to their torment. The hospital's administration knew about the risks but chose to ignore them. As I absorbed this grim revelation, a sudden, cold gust of wind swept through the storage room. The lights flickered, and a chilling presence filled the air. I could hear the whispers again, more urgent and desperate. The spirits were trying to reach us. "We have to do something," I said urgently. "We can't just leave them like this." Dr. Harlan nodded gravely. "There's one thing we can do. We need to perform a ritual to help them find peace. It's dangerous, but it's the only way." He instructed me to gather some items, candles, salt, and old medical records, while he prepared a ceremonial space. As we worked, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. With everything in place, Dr. Harlan began the ritual. He chanted in an old, forgotten language, and I could feel the room vibrating with an otherworldly energy. The air grew thick with the presence of the spirits, their anguished cries echoing through the walls. As the ritual reached its climax, the elevator began to move on its own, its lights flashing erratically. The walls of the storage room seemed to warp and shift, and I could see shadows flitting about, reaching out with ghostly hands. The ritual was working, but it was also stirring up the spirit's rage. Finally, with a loud, mournful wail, the presence of the spirits began to fade. The room returned to normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Dr. Harlan and I stood in silence, the weight of what had happened settling heavily upon us. "We've done what we could," Dr. Harlan said, exhaustion lining his voice. "But the scars of the past will remain. We have to make sure that the history of this place is told, so that the spirits are not forgotten." As I left the hospital, the feeling of dread that had plagued me for so long began to lift. The elevator no longer moved to floor 0, and the disturbances in the hospital seemed to have ceased. But the memory of the haunted floor and the tortured spirits would stay with me forever. I knew that sharing this story was just the beginning. The truth about the asylum needed to be known, and the spirits deserved to be remembered. The hospital's dark past was no longer hidden, and the truth had finally been brought to light.
The Nurse of the Forgotten.
My name is Dr. Emily Carter, and this is the story of the darkest chapter of my medical career. One that began with what should have been a routine shift at St. Anthony's Hospital. When I first arrived at the hospital, I was filled with excitement and a bit of anxiety. It was my first day as a resident, and the pressure to make a good impression was palpable. The sprawling complex of St. Anthony's seemed imposing yet familiar, with its corridors buzzing with the usual hospital hum. I was eager to dive into my new role, helping patients and learning from seasoned doctors. The day had gone smoothly until I was assigned to check on a patient who had been moved for a series of tests. As I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors, I found myself straying from the usual routes. That's when I noticed a door that was partially hidden behind a stack of old medical equipment. The door looked neglected and out of place, its paint peeling and its edges rusted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty hallway. Beyond it was a narrow, dimly lit corridor, and I could immediately feel a shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick with dust and an unsettling chill, and the lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, with rooms on either side. As I ventured further, I noticed that the rooms were furnished with old, outdated medical beds and equipment that hadn't been touched in years. The walls were lined with dusty charts, their contents faded and barely legible. It was clear that this part of the hospital had been abandoned long ago. But what struck me as odd was the presence of patients. Each room had a bed occupied by a patient who looked eerily lifeless. Their faces were pale, their eyes closed, and they seemed almost as if they were in a state of suspended animation. It was disconcerting to see them left here, seemingly neglected. As I walked down the corridor, I felt a growing sense of unease. Why were these patients here? Why were they left in such a state? I couldn't find any recent medical charts or documentation about these patients, and the silence in the ward was suffocating. My heart raced as I quickly left the ward, closing the door behind me. I tried to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for it all, but the sight of those patients and the eerie ambience of the corridor lingered in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the images of the forgotten ward from my thoughts. I knew I needed to talk to someone about it, but I wasn't sure who would believe me. The sense of dread and the mystery of the hidden ward left me feeling more unsettled than I had anticipated. I resolved to ask my colleagues about it the next day. I hoped that there was a simple explanation for what I had seen and that my concerns were just a product of the stress and fatigue of starting a new job. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong at St. Anthony's Hospital. The days following my unsettling discovery were a blur of activity. The hospital's routine seemed to swallow me whole, but the images of the abandoned ward haunted my nights. Each time I closed my eyes, the faces of the patients would appear, their eyes vacant yet pleading. The first dream was vague, a fleeting glimpse of the ward bathed in shadows. But as the nights wore on, the dreams became more vivid and disturbing. I would find myself wandering the corridor again, the flickering lights casting grotesque shapes on the walls. The patients' faces, once still and lifeless, were now contorted in expressions of anguish. They reached out to me with ghostly hands, their silent screams echoing in my ears. I woke up each morning drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The line between dream and reality began to blur. Every creak of my apartment or rustle of the night wind felt like an echo of the ward's eerie silence. I tried to rationalize it: stress, exhaustion, the pressure of my new role. But the dreams persisted, growing more insistent and terrifying. One night, I dreamt that I was in the ward, but this time, the patients weren't lying still. They were up and moving, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded me, their faces mere inches from mine, their eyes wide and hollow. I could hear them whispering my name, their voices merging into a cacophony of despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving. The feeling of their cold, phantom fingers on my skin was so real that I could still feel their touch even after I was awake. I felt a growing sense of panic and dread every time I closed my eyes, knowing that I would be dragged back into that hellish dreamscape. I decided to speak to one of the senior residents, Dr. Harper, about my experiences. I wasn't sure if I was looking for validation or simply someone to listen. When I recounted my dreams and the discovery of the ward, Dr. Harper listened with a concerned but skeptical expression. "Emily, I think you might be overworking yourself," she said gently. "The human mind can play tricks on you when you're under stress. It's not uncommon to have vivid dreams in such circumstances. Perhaps you should take a break or talk to someone about the stress." I appreciated her concern but couldn't shake the feeling that my dreams were more than just a manifestation of stress. There was a gnawing suspicion that something sinister was happening at St. Anthony's, and it was bleeding into my reality. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to investigate further, despite the warnings of my own mind and the skepticism of my colleagues. I needed answers, and I hoped that finding out more about the ward would help me make sense of the nightmare that was consuming my nights. The days turned into weeks, and my obsession with the abandoned ward only deepened. I couldn't let go of the haunting visions that plagued my nights. I decided that if I wanted answers, I would need to dig deeper into the mystery of the ward, even if it meant risking my sanity. I started by trying to gather more information about the ward. I combed through hospital records, looking for any mention of the area I had discovered. I found nothing. No records of patients assigned to that ward, no logs of its usage, and no documentation of any sort. It was as if the ward had never existed, which only fueled my growing unease. Determined not to be deterred, I decided to visit the ward again, this time during the day. The hospital was buzzing with activity, and I hoped that the daylight would make the place seem less sinister. I took a deep breath and made my way to the hidden corridor. When I reached the door, I noticed that it had been recently cleaned and repainted. The once neglected handle was now polished, and the door was firmly locked. My heart sank. It seemed as if someone was actively trying to erase the ward's existence. I was about to turn away when I noticed something glinting on the floor near the door. It was a small, silver key. My hands trembled as I picked it up, feeling a mixture of excitement and fear. Could this key open the door to the ward? The key felt cold and heavy in my palm. With a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and I slowly pushed the door open. The corridor was just as I remembered it, dusty, dimly lit, and filled with the remnants of old medical equipment. The air was still thick with an oppressive silence. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing eerily. The rooms were still lined with old beds and faded charts. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I approached the nearest room. The patient inside was still and silent, their face obscured by shadows. As I moved from room to room, I noticed something unsettling. In each room, there was a single item that seemed out of place: a child's toy, a family photograph, a handwritten letter. It was as if someone had tried to make these rooms feel more personal, more like home. But the items were covered in dust, and the presence of the patients made it all the more disturbing. I continued to explore, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the ward's existence. As I reached the end of the corridor, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Inside was a small office, filled with files and medical records. I rushed in, hoping to find some answers. Among the papers, I found a file labeled Confidential. My hands shook as I opened it. The file contained records of patients who had been admitted under unusual circumstances, cases of unexplained illnesses and treatments that were conducted under strict secrecy. The documents were old, dating back several decades, but they mentioned a doctor who had conducted experimental procedures. The name on the documents was Dr. Victor Hale, a surgeon known for his controversial and secretive methods. According to the records, Dr. Hale had been dismissed and his work discredited after numerous complaints and unexplained patient outcomes. The file hinted at unethical practices and mysterious disappearances. As I read through the documents, a cold realization set in. Dr. Hale's experimental methods had involved a hidden ward where patients with unexplainable conditions were sent to die. It seemed that the ward I had discovered was once a place of dreadful experimentation, a place where patients were forgotten, their suffering ignored. The documents also mentioned a series of unexplained phenomena associated with Dr. Hale's work. Some patients had claimed to see visions or experience strange sensations, but these claims were dismissed as delusions. As I left the office, clutching the file tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Hale's presence still lingered in the ward. I knew that my investigation was far from over, and that I needed to find out more about the fate of the patients and the true extent of Dr. Hale's experiments. But with every step I took, I felt as if I was being watched. The sense of unease was overwhelming, and the shadows of the ward seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The mystery of the ward was becoming a perilous journey into the unknown, and I had no idea where it would lead me next. The documents I found in Dr. Hale's office were chilling. I had to know more. The more I delved into the history, the more it felt like I was uncovering a dark and malevolent force that had been buried beneath the hospital for years. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with fragments of the ward, echoes of anguished cries and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving in the darkness. Each time I tried to make sense of what I saw, the images would shift and dissolve, leaving me more unsettled. The next day, I decided to speak to a few longtime employees at St. Anthony's to see if they knew anything about Dr. Hale or the mysterious ward. I approached a couple of older nurses who had been around for years, hoping that they might shed some light on the matter. I started with Nurse Ellen, who had worked at the hospital for over 30 years. She was a kind woman with a warm smile, but I noticed a flicker of unease in her eyes when I mentioned Dr. Hale. "Oh, Dr. Hale," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I've heard whispers about him, but it was always kept quiet. Some say he was involved in unorthodox practices. It's all very hush-hush." She went on to say that there were stories of strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena connected to Dr. Hale's patients. Nurses and doctors who had worked in the ward had reported feeling watched or hearing voices, but these accounts were often dismissed as the result of stress or fatigue. Her reaction confirmed my fears. It seemed that there was more to the ward's history than met the eye, and the staff's reluctance to talk only deepened the mystery. I decided to dig deeper, starting with the hospital archives. I spent hours poring over old records, searching for any mention of Dr. Hale's patients or the ward. Most of the records were faded and incomplete, but I did find a few references to patients who had been admitted under mysterious circumstances. They were listed as having terminal conditions, with no clear diagnosis, and many had died under unusual or unexplained circumstances. One entry caught my eye. It was a brief note about a patient named Anna, who had been admitted with a rare and incurable disease. Her case was noted for its peculiarities, and her records ended abruptly with a reference to a special treatment administered by Dr. Hale. The note hinted at a series of unexplained complications and a subsequent cover-up. My curiosity was piqued, and I decided to investigate Anna's case further. I visited the hospital's archive room, a musty, dimly lit space where old records and files were kept. I was determined to find more about Anna and her treatment. As I sifted through the documents, I found a small box labeled Patient Records, Confidential. Inside were old medical files and personal belongings of patients who had been treated by Dr. Hale. Among them was a photograph of Anna, a young woman with a hopeful smile. Next to it was a handwritten letter addressed to her family. The letter was filled with a sense of dread and urgency, mentioning that she was undergoing a special treatment that would cure her but had to be kept secret. The letter was cut off abruptly, and the final lines were smeared as if someone had tried to erase them. My heart pounded as I realized that Anna had been a victim of Dr. Hale's experiments. Her desperate plea for help seemed to echo through the pages, and I felt a chill run down my spine. That evening, I decided to return to the abandoned ward to see if there were any clues I had missed. The sense of being watched had grown stronger, and every creak and shadow seemed to whisper warnings. As I entered the corridor, I felt an oppressive weight on my chest, as if the air itself was charged with malevolent energy. I made my way to the rooms where I had seen the patients before. The silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. As I approached one of the rooms, I noticed something different. The door, which had been slightly ajar before, was now wide open. The room inside was empty, the bed stripped of its linens. A cold draft swept through the corridor, and I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to twist and dance, and the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. I felt a sudden sharp chill as if someone, or something, had brushed past me. My breath came out in visible puffs as I hurriedly made my way back to the main corridor. The sense of dread was almost unbearable, and I felt a powerful urge to escape. As I left the ward, I knew I was on the brink of something dark and dangerous. Dr. Hale's experiments, the abandoned patients, and the whispers in the shadows were all part of a larger, more sinister story. I needed to find out the truth before it was too late, but I was beginning to fear for my own safety. The sense of dread that had been growing over the past few weeks reached a fever pitch. I could no longer ignore the creeping terror that followed me wherever I went. The abandoned ward, Dr. Hale's experiments, and the haunting dreams had all converged into something I couldn't ignore any longer. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers and shadows from the ward seemed to have followed me home. My apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in as if they were hiding something from me. I decided I had to go back to the ward one final time. I needed answers, no matter how dangerous the search might be. Armed with a flashlight and a small digital camera, I returned to the ward. The hospital was eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an unsettling silence. I felt a cold shiver as I approached the locked door that I had opened before. To my surprise, the key was still in my pocket. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped into the darkness. The ward was just as I had left it, but there was something different this time. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost alive with a sinister presence. As I moved down the corridor, I noticed that some of the rooms, which had been empty before, now had their doors wide open. I hesitated before entering one of the rooms. It was completely dark, but as I shone my flashlight around, I saw that it was filled with old medical equipment and eerie remnants of the past. The walls were lined with faded charts and strange symbols that had been hastily scribbled. The atmosphere was so oppressive that I felt as though I was being suffocated by it. Then, I heard it. A faint, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It seemed to come from the far end of the corridor. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could almost make out words, pleas for help, cries of despair. I reached the end of the corridor and found another door, slightly ajar. As I pushed it open, I was met with a chilling sight. The room was filled with strange apparatus and diagrams depicting gruesome experiments. In the center of the room was a large, old operating table covered with a sheet. I approached the table with a sense of foreboding. As I pulled back the sheet, I was horrified to see that it was stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The sight made me gag, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over a nearby chair. Then, I noticed something even more horrifying. A large, dusty mirror hung on the wall, reflecting the room in a distorted and eerie manner. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me, a ghostly apparition of a man in a surgical gown. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out his cold, empty eyes. I spun around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and I felt a sense of panic rise within me. It was as if the very essence of Dr. Hale's malevolent spirit was trying to communicate with me. Desperate to get out, I rushed toward the exit. The whispers grew louder, converging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to follow me down the corridor. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I screamed, stumbling through the darkness. As I reached the main door and stepped into the corridor, I glanced back one last time. The door to the ward slammed shut with a resounding bang, and the whispers abruptly stopped. The oppressive silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the cacophony of voices. The next day, I made the decision to leave St. Anthony's Hospital. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that nightmarish ward or confronting the shadowy figure of Dr. Hale. I reported what I had discovered to the hospital administration, but they dismissed my claims as stress-induced hallucinations and refused to investigate further. Even though I left the hospital, I knew that the horrors of the ward would never truly leave me. The dreams continued, and the feeling of being watched never faded. I knew that Dr. Hale's spirit was still lurking somewhere, trapped in the shadows of the abandoned ward. I've come to accept that some mysteries are best left unexplored. The darkness of St. Anthony's Hospital has seeped into my soul, and though I've tried to move on, the echoes of that dreadful place linger in my mind. The ward may have been sealed, but the ghost of Dr. Hale and the suffering of the forgotten patients will forever haunt me.